Hello, Brahms, we're back with So the Witch Won't Eat Me, Fantasy and the Child's Fear of Infanticide. Dorothy Bloch, complete train wreck. She is, but here we go. Chapter 7, The Inhibition of Fantasy, which is a case, or not a case, but The Inhibition of Fantasy, a case of infantile autism, which is a rather short chapter, so I'll try to finish it all and within my 33 minutes that the Illuminati allows me. When we confront the symptomatology of infantile autism, we are assailed by an even more bewildering picture than that which prevails in other forms of schizophrenia. Wait, she's calling autism schizophrenia? Although domination by fantasy generally characterizes schizophrenia, infantile autism is marked by what seems to be a complete inhibition of fantasy and feeling, and by compulsions and rituals that are often incomprehensible until we examine their probable function. As I have discovered in other instances where children resorted to rigid controls and did not allow themselves to fantasize, the object of their defenses frequently appeared to be the management, not merely of violent feelings, but also of violent impulses. Although other dynamics may also exist, these children had been exposed to violence or overwhelmingly violent feelings and frequently had been their target. In the case of Joey, whom I shall discuss here, his stereotyped behavior led me to conclude that the symbolic violence that constantly engaged him represented the compromise between an overriding impulse to kill and an equally powerful need for restraint. Despite the achievement of modern techniques which have established for some time that schizophrenia is reversible and curable, there is still considerable confusion regarding both cure and cause, and beyond that, regarding diagnosis, particularly as it relates to children. In my visit to a school for retarded children, I was struck by the number whom I suspected were schizophrenic rather than retarded. I've also had referred to me a child with the diagnosis of retardation who revealed in the course of treatment a need not to know that dominated almost all areas of functioning and masked what I felt was at least a normal intelligence. Although infantile autism is more readily recognizable, it shares with other forms of schizophrenia the still prevailing bewilderment concerning cause and cure. The reason for the confusion about schizophrenia derived not only from the mystifying character of the symptoms, but also from an understandable reluctance to acknowledge that these symptoms, dreadful as they may appear, are defenses, and that what they defend against may be terror and the fear of killing and of being killed. The symptom picture itself appears neither to follow any particular pattern nor to have any connection with logic or reason. Within its frame, we find withdrawal from reality in the world of relationships, regression sometimes to an infantile state, and inner turmoil characterized by a range of expression that veers from complete blankness to constant eruption, an overwhelming rage whose management requires the greater part of the patient's energy and an extraordinary sensitivity. The continuing reluctance to acknowledge the presence of environmental factors in the genesis of schizophrenia may be traceable to the feelings of guilt and shame that continue to surround the whole area of the parent-child relationship. The denial of any connection between the child's emotional illness and his response to parental handling, which dominated early psychoanalytic thought, is nowhere more evident than in the study of schizophrenia. The well-meaning defenders of parents, by their negation of the parent's role, have merely succeeded in many instances in causing in the parents further repression of feeling and exacerbation of conflict. It is understandable that in order to escape from the intolerable burden of such feelings, many parents find relief in the thought that their children suffer from a congenital, incurable illness in which they have played no part. Were they to allow themselves to think of the possibility of cure, they would inevitably have to confront the probability of cause. The most poignant expression I have encountered of the pain suffered by the parents of schizophrenic children was the unspoken hope communicated by one mother that I would declare her son schizophrenic, a condition she assumed had neither cause nor cure. When I indicated, after several diagnostic sessions, that I thought his condition might be arrested and reversed by psychoanalytic treatment involving a repatterning of her way of handling him, she left and did not return for several years. She clearly preferred to think her child was doomed rather than acknowledge having played any part in his illness. As in her case, only if parents can be helped to accept the relationship between the possibly traumatic nature of their own childhood experience and its influence on their capacity to fulfill their role as parents can they be led to understand their children's response and to accommodate their needs. Since many investigators have held the conviction that schizophrenia is incurable, a great deal of the controversy on the subject has centered on the question of the dynamics. F.J. Coleman's studies of schizophrenic twins have led him to believe that a person is not born schizophrenic or manic depressive, but has a genetic capacity for such a reaction to precipitating stimuli that he has, in other words, a predisposition for the condition, which Coleman feels, however, can be both prevented and cured. Bender describes it as a maturational lag at the embryonic level and administered shock treatment to such children. What? Margaret S. Mahler's concept of symbiotic psychosis stresses the constitutional vulnerability and predisposition for the development of psychosis. Psychodynamic factors inherent in the parent-child relationship and the influence of the schizophrenogenic mother have occupied the attention of an ever-increasing number, among whom are to be found Leo Kanner, to whom we are indebted for his delineation of early infantile autism, Beata Rank, and Louise Despert, bridging the gap between those who stress the biological basis and those who look mainly to its psychogenic origins is the work of P. Bergman and E. Escalona, whose studies of the unusual sensitivities of very young children who later become psychotic led them back to Freud's concept of the perceptive apparatus of our mind, which consists of two layers: an external protective barrier against stimuli whose task it is to diminish the strength of the excitations coming in, and a surface behind it that receives stimuli. To Freud's belief that ego grows in the place, as it were, of the original protective barrier, and it alone protects. They add the concept that the constitutional protective barrier continues to function throughout the individual's life, while the ego adds to the protection. They propose that because of the thinness of this protective barrier, or because of the failure of maternal protection, the infant has to resort to the premature formation of an ego, which, when it breaks down, possibly as a consequence of a trauma, makes way for psychotic manifestations. This concept has been further developed by Dr. Hyman Spotnitz, whose understanding of the problems inherent in the schizophrenic process led him to formulate an effective method of treatment. His method focuses on the problems of insulation and the development of satisfactory patterns for the discharge of aggression. He compared the human mechanism to an electrical system in which non-conducting materials are necessary in order to confine the flow of electricity to the wires. Where these materials are not present in sufficient quantities, and the wires become overloaded, there is likely to be a breakdown. The schizophrenic patient is one who has failed to develop the necessary protective coating or insulation that results when the child receives the proper care. Or did I lose it? Protection and understanding. When this is lacking, the child is not only exposed to overstimulation, which causes him to withdraw in order to establish the necessary insulation, but he is also prevented from developing satisfactory patterns of discharge. Quantities of aggression build up inside that he dares not release out of fear of destroying the people he loves. and depends on for survival. He prefers to turn the aggression against himself. Indications for treatment, therefore, follow very clearly from this concept. The therapist must first of all provide the care, protection, and understanding that the child has not known, thus enabling him to develop the necessary insulation so that he can emerge from a state of withdrawal. He is also trained to release his aggression in a new and more satisfactory way, first through fantasy and later through direct verbalization. I did not have the benefit of Spotnitz's understanding of schizophrenia and his resulting theory of the technique of treatment when, after a year of searching for help, Joey's parents brought him to see me at the age of 5.5 with a diagnosis of infantile autism. As I listened to the moving account of their unflagging efforts on his behalf, I was reminded of Bender's description of the parents of schizophrenic children. Interested parents of schizophrenic children, she stated, stopped short of nothing, even Bellevue, to get attention for their children. If selfishness and concern could have brought about a cure, Joey would certainly have been restored to health. The lives of his parents were given over totally to the care of Joey and his younger brother David, whose abnormality, both physical and psychological, required their constant attention. Since they had to spell each other in the care of David, I never saw them together. Joey's father was a fair, sandy-haired man in his early 40s, tall and heavy-set. He had been married before and divorced. Joey was his first child. He worked at an automobile plant and valued what was an otherwise uninteresting job because the flexibility of the time schedule enabled him to accommodate the demands of his domestic life. The toll taken by his own early deprivations was reflected by his usually unsmiling face and by the severity of his repression of feeling. His reticent communication was usually restricted to factual information and practical details. His wife, attractive and dark-haired and slightly younger than he, was a freer and warmer parent and more in touch with her feelings and Joey's. Although her upbringing appeared to have been less severe, she also communicated a feeling of dammed-up tension. As I continued to know them, I never stopped marveling at the scale of their selfless devotion to their children. It would have been difficult to find more devoted and more cooperative parents. They described Joey as a happy, normal child up to the age of 2.5, when his baby brother was born, although in retrospect, they recalled some behavior at the age of 2 that had struck them as compulsive and some irrational fears. At about the same time, it had been apparent very early that the younger child was not normal, but a year passed before his affliction was clearly identified. Both parents had been completely absorbed by the problem, the mother searching out one doctor after another in a fever of anxiety. And then, once the irrevocable nature of the illness was defined, sinking into a depression that barely allowed her to care for the family. Gradually, she and her husband had become aware that during this period, Joey had undergone a marked change. Although he had already been talking clearly and distinctly and had been a joyous and outgoing child, they noted that at 3.5 he had become silent, except for the expression of his needs, and generally avoided people. At 4, his speech had deteriorated further, and he had become extremely withdrawn. By the time they began to seek help, his behavior fitted the classic description of early infantile autism. His speech had become a disjointed, repetitious jargon, echolalic in character. When he asked a question, instead of answering, he merely repeated it. He lived in an autistic world where people and toys were ignored, spending most of his time silently banging with a stick and making inarticulate sounds. Ritualized behavior and compulsive eating and masturbation had become the norm. He followed a very complicated pattern of walking, taking 3 steps forward, 2 back, and turning himself around. When his parents made their first appointment to see me, they were in despair about even getting him to my office, although they had expressed doubt and concern about his ritualized pattern of walking. Following his first session, he began to lead the way, running ahead until he reached my door. I could ascribe such a dramatic change after such a brief exposure only to the extraordinary contrast that must have existed between the violent tension of his parental environment and the calm, undemanding atmosphere of the therapeutic situation. Joey was a very handsome little boy whose habitually blank expression sometimes gave way to one of sadness. Sometimes he smiled From the very beginning, he appeared not to notice me, but occupied himself with a strange kind of activity that I can only describe as a caricature of violence. He made silent, lunging movements, arresting them just before completion, and banged noiselessly to the accompaniment of garbled sounds, with here and there a word that was distinguishable. He struck me as a child who was profoundly, and in almost every detail of his behavior, on strike. When it was time for him to leave, for instance, presumably instead of kissing me, he kissed the walls and the furniture. After observing his preoccupation with silently banging before his second session, I placed a toy xylophone where he could not fail to see it. He seized the hammers and banged every object in the room except the instrument. He swept to the floor all toys such as checkers, soldiers, design cubes, and anything else he saw on the open shelves. Although he pretended to ignore the toy, I observed that frequently, even while he was seemingly absorbed in banging, he was carefully manipulating it with his toe. Toe? When he was angry, he beat himself on the head or made motions of hitting his hand against his teeth as though to bite it. He never cried with tears, but only made the sounds that accompany crying. Not only did he abandon this ritualized walking after the first session, he also readmitted the limited use of speech. When I announced at the end of that session that it was time to go home, he reiterated, "Want to stay here?" By the 10th session, his mother reported that when she got him ready to come to see me, he stated, "You're going to Dorothy." By the 14th session, when I had introduced a rubber knife, which he found a very useful instrument for shaking, the announcement of the termination of the session was met with, "Want to stay here? Want to play with the knife?" After 9 months of seeing me 3 times a week, he readmitted the use of the pronoun I into his vocabulary. At the time, in answer to my usual way of ending the session, he declared with vigor, "I don't want to hear it's time to go home again. Don't say it's time to go home." Initially, I concentrated on winning Joey's attention and establishing communication. Since he obviously pretended to ignore me from the first, I seated myself at the table and busied myself fashioning simple primary forms out of clay that I thought might interest him. His first response was to come over after a length of time, break up the shapes, and thrust into his mouth a piece of the clay, which he proceeded to chew. I was appalled by the sight of his eating the clay and quickly made available a dish of chocolate bits. In later sessions, I presented him with several varieties, which necessitated the verbal expression of his preference. My handling of this incident demonstrates some of the pitfalls that I encountered. Although he never ate clay again and did verbalize his wishes, it is possible that his angry feelings toward me became less available. As the first session indicated, my greatest area of success was in providing the necessary insulation for him to for him to emerge partially from his withdrawal. By the third session, he sought the physical contact that is a frequent characteristic of autistic children, and came and sat on my lap for 15 minutes while I was occupied with the clay form, soundlessly banging with his stick from that vantage point. Sitting on my lap then became a regular part of every session for many months, his initial activity even after he had allowed himself to become involved in play. It was also his preferred position whenever an occupation such as water play permitted it. The first objects that he accepted as toys were a strainer, which I placed on the faucet, and a hand shower, which I draped over the basin in the bathroom. 2 other activities also met with success. I lit a candle and repeatedly doused it using a water pistol, or blew it out. This immediately engaged his interest. He either doused it himself or blew it out, or he directed me, "Blow it out, okay?" or "Light the candle, okay?" In order to catch his attention, I also introduced an air rifle, which fired 6 ping-pong balls with an explosive noise. He was delighted with it, running to retrieve the balls and replacing them himself. Following that session, immediately on his arrival, he would rush into the playroom, eagerly exclaiming, "Light the candle, shoot the balls." With this method, the rituals disappeared and eating and masturbation became almost normal. He noticed his parents and played with his father and even with his brother when he thought he was unobserved. He demanded attention in the presence of visitors. Instead of retiring to his room, he made known his wants. He made known his wants and responded cooperatively to simple requests. He bathed and dressed himself and slept in his own bed. He no longer clung to the house, but played outside a great deal and went adventuring into the neighborhood. Eventually, he was able to attend a day camp and a school for children with special problems. It is difficult to evaluate how much more this method might have accomplished had his familial environment remained stable. At one point, however, his mother required surgery, necessitating a week's hospitalization. No amount of explanation could eradicate the memory of her earlier absence and its aftermath, her returning with his baby brother. After her departure this time, he came to his session filled with despair, crying without tears, and reiterating, "And now a baby, a baby." That incident caused a degree of withdrawal once more and was followed by a period during which his brother's condition deteriorated markedly, eventually requiring that he be institutionalized and finally leading to his death. The impact of these events on Joey's parents was tragic. As David became increasingly unmanageable, they faced the inevitable separation with great courage and once more accommodated their lives to the new routine of periodic visits to the hospital, making those outings as much as possible a family picnic involving Joey. The sadness of the separation and finally of the death took its toll. When added to that, Joey's father had an accident at work. Although it was minor, the stability of the family seemed to go. The father went into treatment for a time, but then the mother broke down. It is perhaps a measure of their devotion to Joey as much as of their basic vitality that they both recovered sufficiently to continue functioning as parents. In gauging the effect of these developments on Joey, we have to take into account that at his stage of development he could only have interpreted them magically, as having been caused by him. He most likely felt he had not only precipitated his mother's hospitalization and her wish for another child, but that he was responsible for David's being sent away, and he feared he might also therefore be gotten rid of. We can only guess at his response to the mounting tensions of his parents, as one tragic incident followed another. Nevertheless, although he did not again recapture the enthusiasm expressed by his greeting of "light the candle, shoot the balls," he maintained and extended his other gains. Although I was unfamiliar with Spotnik's concept of the nature and treatment of schizophrenia when I saw Joey, in retrospect, it illuminates the reasons for both my success and my failure. Although I succeeded in developing a sufficient degree of insulation to permit him to emerge from his withdrawal, my failure to release his rage sufficiently restricted its scope. Because the sessions were very meaningful, the announcement of their termination became a natural means of evoking a direct and verbal expression of his aggressive feelings. His verbal responses during the first 9-month period occurred at those moments when he experienced the highest degree of frustration in relation to me. My announcement that the session was over. That sequence of events therefore suggests that he had been provided repeatedly with situations that elicited his rage. It might have been possible to repattern his rage response to a much larger degree. Although my method of treating him did not affect the cure, it did arrest and partially reverse the schizophrenic process. At one point, my demonstration of more effective method of dealing with his rage succeeded in reversing its direction, but only by vicarious means and only momentarily. During one session, when he arrived in an obviously disturbed state in which he beat himself and banged his arm against his teeth, crying without tears, I seized a piece of clay and proceeded to pound it violently until it was completely flattened. He immediately became quiet, and when I finished, he broke the clay into bits and handed them to me for a repeat performance. Prompted each time by his breaking up the clay and presenting it to me, I repeated it several times, a record for cooperative activity up to that time. Although the experience of cooperation was symbolized after that by his carefully making and allowing to remain for the first time a finger imprint in a ball of clay that I had rolled, instead of destroying it as he had done previously, it did not lead him subsequently to direct his rage outward. To have brought this about, it would have been necessary to have expanded those moments of frustration that first moved him to speech, and to have provided him with additional provocations. Joey's response to treatment. not only established that in his case, infantile autism was reversible and with the correct method probably curable, but suggested that his autism, with the variety of its symptomatology, was a complex defense necessitated by the threatening character of his environment and his fear of being killed and killing, and of killing. Whether or not all children would have responded as Joey did, and to what degree, therefore, hereditary or constitutional factors played a part, are questions we are still in no position to answer. The importance of environmental factors, however, is eminently clear. The readmission of speech at the end of the first session and the startling disappearance immediately after that of his ritualized pattern of walking informs us not only of the extraordinary effectiveness of a therapeutic atmosphere, but also of the intensity of the threat that necessitated his defenses. The nature of that threat and his response were dramatically represented by his rituals, his requirement that he always have an object to shake or to bang without sound, and the silent and arrested lunging movements that punctuated that activity suggest an overwhelming preoccupation with aggression that, at all costs, had to be reduced to safe and unrecognizable symbols. In retrospect, it is also possible to hypothesize that his substitution at a later stage of his treatment of a flimsy L-shaped piece of paper for his more solid wooden stick represented a lessening of the internal and external degree of threat he experienced. The symptomatology of infantile autism, with its retreat from reality and the world of relationships, its compulsive patterns of behavior, and its rituals, its garbled and incomprehensible use of speech that kept under repression his perception of his parents' feelings and his response to them, became his refuge. The inhibition of fantasy and feeling, which is a function of compulsions and rituals, and frequently a reliable barometer of the degree of actual violence or of violent feelings to which a child has been exposed, protected him from his own violent response to his parents' violence or intensely violent feelings. The interruption of the insulating process following the traumatic impact on his parents of the discovery of his infant brother's abnormality caused him to withdraw in order to protect himself against internal and external stimuli. That he was continually involved in symbolic acts of violence might also indicate that he was preoccupied with controlling both violent feelings and violent impulses as well. The atmosphere of his psychoanalytic treatment, which made him feel cared for, protected, and understood, helped him to develop sufficient insulation to emerge from his withdrawal to a considerable degree. To the extent that he was provided with opportunities to release his aggressive feelings, he was able to direct them outward instead of turning them against himself. I'm not sure how many people with children with autism will feel about that chapter, but there we go. We're more than halfway through this book. We will start part 2 next time. Goodbye, bros. Goodbye.